September 17th, 1944. Forward Medical Station, Normandy, France. The surgical tent smelled of disinfectant and blood as Captain Theodore Hartmann, U.S. Army Medical Corps, closed the field casualty report with trembling hands. The document bore a single devastating statistic written in stark black ink. Tank commanders fighting with hatches open suffered a mortality rate 312% higher than those who fought buttoned up. Each number represented a name, a face, a man who had died because he couldn't resist the primal urge to see his enemy. What Hartmann held wasn't just a medical report, it was evidence of a killing pattern so consistent, so predictable, that it would force armies to choose between a commander's instinct and his survival. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not with statistics or doctrine, but with a young lieutenant standing in the commander's hatch of his Sherman tank on a bright morning in Tunisia, February 1943. Lieutenant James Macready, of the 1st Armoured Division, 3rd Battalion, had been in North Africa for exactly 8 days. At 23 years old, with a degree in mechanical engineering from Ohio State University, he represented the new breed of American tank officer, educated, trained, confident. The morning sun warmed his face as his platoon of 4 M4 Shermans rolled across the dusty plain toward Kasserine Pass, where American forces would face German armor for the first time. Macready rode with his head and shoulders completely exposed above the turret, hands resting on the hatch rim. This was how he'd been taught at Fort Knox. This was how every tank commander in every army fought. You couldn't command a tank from inside a steel box with limited vision ports. You needed to see the battlefield, read the terrain, spot threats, coordinate with other tanks, communicate with infantry. The manual was explicit. The tank commander must maintain constant visual awareness of his tactical environment. Veteran tankers called it fighting heads up. It was doctrine, it was common sense, it was how you survived. By sunset that day, Macready would be dead, killed instantly by a bullet that entered his throat at 2,800 feet per second from a German MG-42 machine gun positioned 400 yards away. The gunner who killed him never saw Macready as a person, just as a target, a silhouette against the sky, the most visible thing on the tank. Macready's crew found him slumped in the hatch, blood pooling on the turret floor. The tank itself was undamaged. The crew was uninjured. But without their commander, they were effectively out of the fight. They withdrew, carrying Macready's body, becoming another statistic in a pattern that was killing tank commanders at an appalling rate. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, which raged from February 19th to 25th, 1943, was America's first major engagement against German forces in the European theatre. It was a disaster. American forces, inexperienced and poorly coordinated, were badly mauled by veteran German units under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Americans suffered over 6,000 casualties, lost 183 tanks, and were driven back 50 miles in humiliating retreat. But buried within those grim numbers was a smaller, more specific statistic that troubled medical officers and battalion commanders. Tank commanders were dying at rates far exceeding their crew members. In some units, commander casualties exceeded 40%, while driver, gunner, and loader casualties remained under 15%. Something was systematically killing the men in the commander's position. Captain William Spence, a battalion surgeon with the 1st Armoured Division, began keeping meticulous records in a leather-bound notebook. Each entry followed the same format: name, rank, unit, nature of wound, position in tank, whether hatches were open or closed. By early March 1943, after treating dozens of tank casualties from Kasserine, patterns emerged that disturbed him deeply. The commander is invariably the first casualty when a tank is engaged. Spence wrote in a report to division headquarters dated March 8, 1943. Wounds are concentrated in the head, neck, and upper torso areas exposed when fighting from an open hatch. Cause of death in 73% of commander casualties: small arms fire, artillery fragments, or blast effects that would have been stopped by closed armor. The tank itself often survives intact while the commander does not. Spence's report circulated among medical officers but gained little traction with operational commanders. The consensus remained unchanged. Tank commanders must fight heads up to maintain situational awareness. The alternative, commanding from inside with hatches closed, called buttoned up, was considered tactically unacceptable. You couldn't fight effectively if you couldn't see. This conviction was shared across all armies. British tank commanders in North Africa routinely fought from open hatches. German panzer commanders stood upright in their cupolas, using excellent optics but still preferring direct vision. Soviet tank commanders, despite notoriously poor vision devices in their T-34 seconds, kept hatches open whenever possible because the alternative was near blindness. The doctrine made sense based on World War I experience, where tanks had moved slowly across static battlefields, more concerned with trenches and wire than enemy snipers. But World War II was different. Battlefields were fluid, filled with small arms fire, artillery fragments, and enemy soldiers specifically trained to target tank commanders, the most visible and vulnerable member of any tank crew. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what the casualty statistics were revealing. The very practice that made commanders feel most effective was killing them at extraordinary rates. The pattern repeated itself across every theatre. In the North African desert, British tank commanders of the 7th Armoured Division learned to scan horizons from open hatches, spotting German positions at long range. But German grenadiers learned equally well to watch for those exposed silhouettes and target them first with rifles and machine guns. A good rifleman could kill a tank commander at 300 yards. A machine gunner could suppress an entire tank platoon, forcing commanders to duck down, blinding their tanks at critical moments. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Vaux of the British 7th Armoured Division wrote candidly in his diary about the dilemma facing every tank commander. You must see to fight, but the moment you rise to see, you become the target. We lose commanders weakly to wounds that would never penetrate our armour. The men know this. Every time a commander's hatch opens, the crew tenses, waiting for the crack of the sniper's rifle. The psychological burden was immense. Tank commanders knew they were exposed. They knew the odds. But they also knew that fighting buttoned up meant severely restricted vision through narrow periscopes, inability to coordinate effectively with other tanks, difficulty spotting enemy positions, and a claustrophobic sense of isolation that veteran commanders found intolerable. Most chose visibility over protection. Most paid for that choice. By summer 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, the tank commander casualty problem had become severe enough to affect operational effectiveness. Some tank platoons had lost 3 or 4 commanders in as many weeks, with inexperienced replacements stepping into a position that seemed to carry a death sentence. Major Robert Marsh, operations officer for the 2nd Armoured Division's 66th Armoured Regiment, compiled disturbing data in June 1943. His unit had suffered 127 tank crewman casualties since landing in North Africa 6 months earlier. Of those, 61 were tank commanders, 48% of total casualties, despite commanders representing only 20% of crew positions. Commanders were dying at more than twice the rate of other crew members. More troubling still, the nature of the wounds. In 71% of commander casualties, the tank itself was undamaged or lightly damaged, Marsh wrote. The commander died or was wounded by fire that never threatened the tank's combat capability. We are losing leaders to threats that our armour is designed to defeat simply because they position themselves outside that armour. Marsh's report included a provocative recommendation. Consideration should be given to requiring tank commanders to fight buttoned up except during administrative movement in secure areas. While this reduces tactical awareness, it may preserve experienced leadership that is currently being lost at unsustainable rates. The recommendation was rejected immediately by regimental and division commanders. The consensus remained firm. Tank commanders must maintain visual situational awareness. Buttoning up was acceptable for crew members, but commanders needed to see. The alternative, commanding a tank through periscopes, was deemed tactically unacceptable, given the limited field of view and poor optics available in 1943. Lieutenant Harold Becker, a platoon leader in the 2nd Armoured Division who survived the entire North African campaign, later recalled the culture that kept commanders exposed. It was a matter of pride and professionalism. A commander who buttoned up was considered timid, overly cautious, unable to lead effectively. We'd been trained that leadership meant visibility, being seen by your crew, by other tanks, by the infantry we supported. You couldn't lead from inside a steel cave. So we stayed heads up, even though we all knew men who'd been killed doing exactly that. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 provided more grim data. American and British forces landed on the island's southern coast, pushing north against determined German and Italian resistance. Tank battles erupted across the rugged terrain, with narrow roads, stone villages, and terraced hillsides creating ideal conditions for ambushes. German infantry, armed with excellent MG-42 machine guns and positioned in elevated buildings, devastated Allied tank commanders. The MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 bullets per second, creating a curtain of fire that made open hatches suicidal. Yet Allied commanders continued fighting heads up because tactical doctrine demanded it, and because no one had yet proven that the alternative was viable. Captain Edward Morrison of the British 4th County of London Yeomanry described the horror in a letter home dated August 3, 1943. Good men, experienced leaders, killed by machine gun fire while doing their jobs exactly as trained. Yesterday, Jenkins took a burst across the chest from an MG while his tank was supporting infantry in Centuripe. The tank was untouched. His crew was fine. But Jenkins is dead, and now we're putting a sergeant in command who's barely 20 years old and terrified of that hatch. By late 1943, the pattern was undeniable across multiple armies and theatres. Tank commanders were dying at rates 2 to 3 times higher than their crews, almost always from wounds to exposed portions of their bodies, almost always when fighting from open hatches. The question was no longer whether there was a problem, the casualty statistics proved conclusively there was, but whether anyone would challenge the deeply embedded doctrine that kept commanders exposed. The man who would ultimately force that challenge was neither a combat commander nor a tactical theorist. He was a doctor who couldn't stop counting the dead. Captain Theodore Hartmann had enlisted in the Army Medical Corps in 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, motivated by his father's service in the previous war and his own sense that America would inevitably be drawn into the expanding conflict. At 31, he was older than most new officers, with a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and 3 years of surgical residency at Massachusetts General Hospital. The Army assigned him to the 3rd Armoured Division as a battalion surgeon, a position that put him in close contact with tank casualties throughout the North African and Italian campaigns. Hartmann wasn't a statistician or researcher by training, but he had a compulsive need to understand patterns. In medical school, he'd been fascinated by epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread through populations. He approached combat casualties the same way, looking for patterns that might reveal underlying causes and, potentially, preventive measures. In a small tent at a forward aid station near Salerno, Italy, in October 1943, Hartmann began his systematic study. He obtained casualty reports from every armoured unit in the division, going back to the Tunisia campaign in early 1943. He categorized each tank crewman casualty by position commander, gunner, driver, loader, assistant driver, nature of wound, weapon that caused the injury, and whether the tank's hatches were open or closed at the time of wounding. The work was tedious, requiring him to cross-reference after-action reports, medical records, and interviews with surviving crew members. Many nights he worked by lamplight until 2 or 3 a.m., filling notebooks with data, creating charts and tables that slowly revealed the shape of what he was seeing. By December 1943, Hartmann had analysed 412 tank crewman casualties from 9 months of combat across 3 campaigns. The results were staggering. Tank commanders comprised 89 of the 412 casualties, 21.6% of the total, despite representing only 20% of crew positions. But that alone wasn't remarkable. What shocked Hartmann was the breakdown by position and hatch status. Of the 89 commander casualties, 81 occurred while fighting from an open hatch. Only 8 commanders were wounded while buttoned up, and those injuries were almost entirely from penetrating hits that destroyed the tank situations where the hatch position made no difference. Commanders fighting heads up suffered wounds primarily to the head, 41%, neck, 23%, and upper torso, 28%. These were invariably caused by small arms fire, artillery fragments, or blast effects threats that tank armor was specifically designed to defeat. The commanders had voluntarily positioned themselves outside that protection and paid with their lives. By contrast, gunners, drivers, and loaders, who typically fought buttoned up with hatches closed, suffered casualties almost entirely from penetrating hits that destroyed or disabled the tank. When their tank was knocked out, they were wounded or killed along with everyone else. But they weren't dying from small arms fire or fragments that their armor would have stopped. Hartmann calculated the mortality rate for each position. Commanders fighting heads up had a 34% mortality rate when wounded. Other crew members had an 11% mortality rate when wounded. Commanders were 3 times more likely to die from their wounds than other crew members, not because the wounds were necessarily more severe, but because they were more likely to be shot in vital areas, head and neck, that were immediately fatal. But the most striking finding came when Hartmann compared survival rates directly. He calculated that tank commanders fighting from open hatches were 3.12 times more likely to become casualties than commanders who fought buttoned up. The number was so dramatic he recalculated it 3 times to ensure accuracy. 312% higher casualty rate for fighting heads up, more than triple the risk. In epidemiological terms, it was one of the strongest risk associations Hartmann had ever seen. It was comparable to the increased lung cancer risk from smoking or the increased infection risk from surgery without antiseptic technique. The correlation was undeniable, statistically overwhelming, and completely at odds with established tactical doctrine. On January 15, 1944, Hartmann submitted his report through medical channels to the 3rd Armored Division surgeon, then to the division commander, then to 1st Army Headquarters. The document, titled Positional Casualty Analysis, Tank Commander Vulnerability Study, North Africa and Italy Campaigns, February-December 1943, ran to 28 pages, including detailed statistical tables and case studies. The report's conclusion was unambiguous. Tank commanders fighting from open hatches suffer casualty rates more than 3 times higher than commanders who fight buttoned up. This elevated risk is entirely attributable to exposure to small arms fire and artillery fragments that would be defeated by closed armor. Recommendation: tactical doctrine should be revised to require commanders to fight buttoned up except during movement in secure rear areas. While this reduces direct visual observation, the preservation of experienced leadership offsets tactical limitations. The report landed like a bombshell and was immediately controversial. Combat commanders rejected Hartmann's findings almost unanimously. Brigadier General Leroy Watson, commanding Combat Command A of the 3rd Armored Division, wrote a blistering response. Captain Hartmann's statistical analysis, while thorough, fundamentally misunderstands tank warfare. A commander must see the battlefield to fight effectively. Reduced visibility from fighting buttoned up would result in more tanks being knocked out, more objectives failing, more casualties among the entire crew. We accept higher commander casualties as the cost of effective leadership. Colonel James Roy, commander of the 33rd Armored Regiment, was equally dismissive. Statistics divorced from tactical reality are meaningless. Yes, commanders are more exposed. Yes, they suffer higher casualties. But their visibility enables the tank to fight effectively, protecting the entire crew. A blind tank is a dead tank. Better to lose commanders who can be replaced than to lose entire crews to poor tactical awareness. The resistance wasn't just about tactics. It was cultural, almost primal. Tank commanders were the elite of the armored force, the leaders, the decision-makers, the men other soldiers looked to for courage and direction. Fighting heads up was a visible symbol of that leadership. To button up felt like hiding, like shirking the responsibilities of command. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, a platoon leader who'd fought through Sicily and would later fight across France, articulated the sentiment in his diary. Hartmann's report makes logical sense on paper. Numbers don't lie. But there's something he doesn't understand because he's not a tanker. When you're buttoned up, you're not just losing visibility, you're losing connection with your crew, with other tanks, with the battle itself. You feel trapped, isolated, helpless. Every commander I know would rather take the risk and see what's happening than be sealed inside wondering what's about to kill him. The debate that erupted over Hartmann's report in early 1944 revealed a fundamental tension in military doctrine. The conflict between statistical evidence and tactical intuition, between what the data showed and what experience suggested, between innovation and tradition. Hartmann's supporters, primarily medical officers, and a handful of more analytically minded combat officers, argued that the statistics were irrefutable. Commanders were dying at unacceptable rates from preventable causes. The solution was obvious: keep hatches closed. The opposition, the vast majority of combat commanders and tankers, argued that statistics couldn't capture the complexity of tactical decision-making. Visibility enabled better tactical awareness, faster reactions, more effective coordination. A commander who couldn't see was a liability, even if he survived longer. The debate would continue throughout the spring of 1944 as Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Somewhere across the English Channel, in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, the question would finally be settled not by debate or doctrine, but by blood and survival in the most intense armoured combat of the war. Tank commanders would learn, through casualties that nothing else could teach, whether seeing the enemy was worth dying to do it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The answer came written in blood across the hedgerows of Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, tank units prepared to follow, bringing armoured power to support the infantry fighting inland. But the tanks wouldn't arrive immediately. The beaches needed to be secured, exits cleared, and logistics established before armour could be brought ashore in meaningful numbers. The first Shermans rolled off landing craft onto Omaha Beach on June 7th, churning through sand still littered with the debris of yesterday's fighting. By June 10th, entire armoured battalions were ashore and pushing inland, moving through the strange, deadly terrain that would define the Normandy campaign. The bocage country of northwestern France was unlike anything American tankers had encountered in North Africa or even Sicily. Ancient agricultural practices had created a landscape of small fields, each surrounded by thick hedgerows, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, often 6 to 8 feet high and equally thick. These hedgerows created a maze of natural obstacles that channeled movement, blocked visibility, and provided perfect concealment for German infantry armed with Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets. For tank commanders accustomed to the open deserts of North Africa or the rolling hills of Tunisia, the bocage was claustrophobic and terrifying. Visibility from inside a buttoned-up tank was effectively zero in this terrain. You couldn't see over the hedgerows, couldn't spot threats until they were close enough to kill you. The natural response was to fight heads up, standing in the hatch to see over the vegetation. German infantry, dug into positions throughout the bocage, waited for exactly that. Lieutenant Robert Ellison, commanding a platoon of the 2nd Armoured Division's 67th Armoured Regiment, moved cautiously through a sunken lane near the village of Saint-Jean-de-Deye on June 15th. His head and shoulders were exposed above the commander's hatch as he scanned the hedgerows to his left and right, looking for any sign of German positions. He never saw the grenadier hidden in the foliage 30 yards away. The single rifle shot caught Ellison in the side of the head, killing him instantly. His body slumped forward onto the turret as his crew, sealed inside the tank, initially had no idea what had happened. Only when the gunner glanced up through his periscope and saw blood running down the turret side did they realize their commander was dead. The tank reversed frantically out of the lane, leaving Ellison's body draped over the hatch, a sight that would haunt his crew for the rest of their lives. They'd been in Normandy for 9 days. Ellison had been their third commander. His 2 predecessors had also been killed by small arms fire while fighting from open hatches. The pattern that had troubled medical officers like Captain Hartmann since 1943 was accelerating dramatically in Normandy's close terrain. Tank commanders were being killed at rates even higher than in previous campaigns, sometimes within hours of reaching the front lines. Replacement commanders, often freshly arrived from training units in England, would take over a tank and be dead within days, sometimes within hours. Staff Sergeant Walter Chen of the 3rd Armoured Division witnessed the revolving door of commanders in his battalion. He recalled in a letter written in July 1944, "Every one of them died the same way, shot from a hedgerow while standing in the hatch. The new ones would arrive, confident and well-trained, and the veterans would just look at them with this quiet sadness because we knew they'd be dead soon because they couldn't resist standing up to see." It got to the point where crews stopped learning their new commander's name for the first few days, figuring he probably wouldn't last long enough to matter. By late June 1944, the commander-casualty problem had reached crisis proportions in some units. Medical officers in Normandy began compiling statistics that confirmed Hartmann's earlier findings and showed the problem was even worse than previously documented. Major Samuel Winters, division surgeon for the 4th Armoured Division, analysed casualties from the division's first 3 weeks in Normandy. Of 247 tank crewman casualties, 104 were commanders, 42% of total casualties, despite commanders representing only 20% of crew positions. Commanders were being wounded or killed at more than twice the rate of other crew members. More striking, of those 104 commander casualties, 97 occurred while fighting from open hatches in situations where the tank itself survived the engagement. Only 7 commanders were lost when their tanks were completely knocked out by German anti-tank weapons. The vast majority died from threats their armour could have defeated, if only they'd been behind it. Winters calculated the mortality rate for commander casualties at 41%, meaning nearly half of all wounded commanders died from their wounds, compared to just 14% mortality for other crew positions. Commanders were being shot in the head and neck at point-blank range by German infantry who'd learned to target the most visible member of any tank crew. "We are hemorrhaging experienced leadership at an unsustainable rate," Winters wrote in a report dated June 28, 1944. Platoon leaders survive an average of 6.7 days before becoming casualties. Company commanders average 11.3 days. "We are losing tactical knowledge and unit cohesion that cannot be replaced by sending fresh lieutenants from England who have never seen combat." But something else was happening in Normandy that would finally force a change in doctrine. Something that contradicted every assumption about the necessity of fighting heads up. A handful of tank commanders, motivated by the staggering casualty rates among their peers and willing to defy convention, had begun experimenting with fighting buttoned up. They were discovering, to their surprise, that it was actually possible to command effectively from inside the tank if you adapted your tactics and learned to trust your crew. Captain Richard Hobart of the 2nd Armoured Division was one of the early converts. After losing 2 platoon leaders in 3 days to sniper fire, both killed instantly while standing in their hatches, Hobart ordered his remaining commanders to fight buttoned up except during administrative movement in rear areas. The order was deeply unpopular. His platoon leaders protested that they couldn't see, couldn't coordinate, couldn't lead effectively from inside. Hobart was unmoved. "I'd rather have you alive and slightly less effective than dead and useless," he told them bluntly. "You're going to learn to fight buttoned up, or I'll find commanders who will." What Hobart and his commanders discovered over the following weeks challenged fundamental assumptions about tank warfare. Fighting buttoned up required significant adaptation. The commander couldn't see the entire battlefield at a glance. He had to rely more heavily on his crew members, the gunner scanning through his telescopic sight, the driver reporting what he saw through his periscope, radio communication with other tanks describing what they observed. The commander had to coordinate information from multiple sources and build a mental picture of the battlefield, rather than simply looking at it directly. Hobart's company maintained operational effectiveness while suffering 0 commander casualties over a 2-week period in early July, a period when other companies in the battalion lost 6 commanders to small arms fire. Word spread quietly among tank commanders that Hobart's crews were surviving at dramatically higher rates while still accomplishing their missions. Some commanders began experimenting with staying buttoned up during combat, particularly in the dense hedgerow country, where visibility from an open hatch was limited anyway. Lieutenant Frank Morrison of the 3rd Armoured Division began fighting buttoned up after watching his best friend, Lieutenant David Chang, get killed by a sniper on July 3rd. Morrison had been in the tank immediately behind Chang's when the shot rang out. He'd watched Chang's body slump forward, seen the blood, heard the anguished radio calls from Chang's crew. That night, Morrison made a decision that probably saved his life. "I decided Chang's death wouldn't be meaningless," Morrison wrote in his diary. "If staying heads up was killing commanders this quickly, then I'd try the alternative, regardless of what Doctrine said. I told my crew we were buttoning up, and we'd figure out how to make it work." Morrison developed techniques that other commanders would later adopt. He positioned his gunner to scan continuously through the telescopic sight, which offered better magnification than the naked eye anyway. He trained his driver to report everything visible through the driver's periscope, treating him as another set of eyes. He coordinated closely with adjacent tanks by radio, with each commander describing what they could see from their position, creating a composite picture of the battlefield. Most importantly, Morrison learned to move more deliberately, pausing frequently to raise his hatch briefly, scan the surroundings, then button up again before moving forward. These quick looks, never more than 5 or 10 seconds, with head exposed, gave him periodic visual updates while minimizing exposure time. German snipers needed time to acquire targets and fire accurately. Brief exposures made commanders much harder to hit. Over 3 weeks in July, Morrison's tank participated in 11 combat actions in the bocage. His tank was hit twice by German anti-tank fire, but survived both engagements. Morrison himself was never wounded. His crew suffered no casualties. Meanwhile, his battalion lost 7 other platoon leaders, all killed by small arms fire while fighting from open hatches. Morrison's survival wasn't luck, it was a direct result of his decision to fight buttoned up. And he wasn't alone. Other commanders who adopted similar techniques showed similarly improved survival rates. By late July 1944, an informal but unmistakable pattern had emerged in American armoured units in Normandy. Commanders who consistently fought buttoned up survived at dramatically higher rates than those who fought heads up. The data that Captain Hartmann had documented statistically in late 1943 was now being proven operationally in combat. But institutional resistance remained strong. Many senior commanders still insisted that fighting buttoned up was tactically unacceptable, that reduced visibility would lead to more tanks being knocked out, that leadership required being seen by the crew and other units. The debate came to a head at a battalion commanders' conference on July 28, 1944, held in an orchard near the village of Coutances. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henderson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 66th Armoured Regiment, had convened his company commanders to discuss tactics following the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead Operation Cobra, which had finally ruptured German lines and allowed mobile warfare to resume. The meeting quickly became heated when the topic of commander casualties arose. Captain Hobart, whose company had suffered 0 commander losses while others had lost multiple leaders, described his policy of requiring commanders to fight buttoned up. Major Douglas Warren, commanding A Company, responded with barely concealed contempt. "With all respect, Hobart, your men are alive because they've been lucky, not because they're hiding inside their tanks. A commander who can't see the battlefield is a liability. Your survival rate is an anomaly that won't persist once the fighting intensifies." Hobart's response was cutting. My commanders are alive because they're not standing upright presenting targets to every German rifleman in Normandy. Your company has lost 3 platoon leaders in 2 weeks, all killed exactly the same way, shot while standing in their hatches. At what point does that pattern stop being bad luck and start being bad tactics? Colonel Henderson intervened before the argument could escalate further. Gentlemen, we're not here to debate doctrine, we're here to win battles, but I think it's worth examining the data objectively. Henderson had requested casualty statistics from division headquarters, and what he read aloud to the assembled officers was sobering. Since landing in Normandy on June 10th, the battalion had suffered 183 total casualties among tank crews. Of those, 71 were commanders, 38.8% of casualties, despite commanders representing only 20% of crew positions. More telling, of the 71 commander casualties, 64 had occurred while fighting from open hatches in situations where the tanks survived the engagement. Only 7 commanders had been lost when their tanks were knocked out completely, situations where hatch position made no difference. Gentlemen, Henderson said quietly, we're losing commanders at twice the rate of other crew members, almost entirely to threats that our armour is designed to defeat. Captain Hobart's company, which has required buttoned-up fighting for 3 weeks, has suffered 0 commander casualties while maintaining comparable beef operational effectiveness to other companies. I don't believe that's luck. I believe that's evidence. The room fell silent. Henderson continued. Effective immediately, this battalion will adopt the following policy. Tank commanders will fight buttoned up during combat operations, except when the tactical situation specifically requires otherwise. Commanders may open hatches for brief observation when stationary in covered positions, but movement under fire will be conducted buttoned up. This is not a suggestion, it's an order. The resistance was palpable. Several company commanders protested that their platoon leaders would refuse, that the men wouldn't accept being forced to hide, that combat effectiveness would suffer. Henderson was unmoved. The next commander who dies with his hatch open will die in violation of a direct order, Henderson said flatly, and I will personally write to his family explaining that he was killed because he refused to follow basic force protection measures. We've lost too many good men to a problem that has a simple solution. Starting tomorrow, hatches stay closed during combat. Henderson's order, initially controversial and bitterly resented by many commanders, saved lives almost immediately. Over the next 4 weeks, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France in a rapid pursuit of retreating German forces, the 2nd Battalion suffered 8 commander casualties. All 8 occurred in situations where tanks were knocked out by anti-tank fire or mines, situations where buttoning up offered no protection. 0 commanders were killed by small arms fire or artillery fragments, while their tanks survived the engagement. By contrast, neighbouring battalions that had not adopted similar policies continued losing commanders to sniper fire, machine guns, and artillery fragments at rates comparable to earlier in the campaign. Word of Henderson's policy and its results spread through the 2nd Armoured Division, then to other divisions. By September 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, more and more armoured units were formally or informally adopting buttoned-up fighting as standard practice. The change wasn't universal or immediate. Cultural resistance remained strong in many units. Some commanders considered fighting heads up a matter of personal courage and professional pride. Others genuinely believed they couldn't fight effectively without direct vision. The debate continued in training schools, staff meetings, and field journals throughout late 1944, but the statistics were becoming undeniable. Units that adopted buttoned-up fighting showed dramatically reduced commander casualties, without corresponding increases in tank losses or mission failures. The 3.12 times higher casualty rate that Captain Hartmann had calculated in his 1944 report was being confirmed repeatedly in unit after unit across multiple divisions. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armoured Division and one of the most aggressive armour commanders in the European theatre, examined the casualty data in October 1944 and issued division-wide guidance that effectively mandated buttoned-up fighting except in specific circumstances. Tank commanders will remain buttoned up during movement under fire, Rose's directive stated. Brief observation with hatches open is authorized when stationary in covered or concealed positions. Administrative movement in rear areas may be conducted with hatches open at the commander's discretion. This policy is based on casualty analysis, showing that commanders fighting from open hatches suffer casualty rates more than 3 times higher than commanders who fight buttoned up, with no corresponding increase in tactical effectiveness. Rose's order was significant not just because it came from division level, but because Rose himself was known as an exceptionally aggressive, forward-leading commander who took personal risks that many considered excessive. Even Rose, who would ultimately be killed in March 1945, while far forward of his headquarters was ordering commanders to button up, it legitimized the practice for officers who might otherwise have seen it as cowardly. The transition to buttoned-up fighting represented more than just a tactical adjustment. It required a fundamental reimagining of how tank commanders performed their role. The old model of tank command had emphasized personal observation and visible leadership. The commander stood in his hatch, observed the battlefield directly, gave orders by voice and hand signals, and provided a visible focal point for his crew and other tanks. This model worked adequately in open terrain against enemies who lacked effective small arms, or in earlier eras when tank warfare moved more slowly. The new model emphasized information integration and crew coordination. The commander remained inside the tank, gathered information from multiple sources: his gunner's sight, his driver's observations, radio reports from other tanks, occasional brief visual checks, and synthesized that information into a coherent tactical picture. He coordinated his crew more deliberately, relying on established procedures and clear communication rather than on-the-spot improvisation based on what he could personally see. This transition required training. Commanders needed to learn to trust their crew members as additional sensors. Gunners needed training in systematic scanning techniques to compensate for the commander's limited visibility. Drivers needed to understand they were now expected to report observations actively, not just follow directions. Radio discipline became more important as commanders relied more heavily on communication with adjacent tanks. But units that invested in this training found that buttoned-up fighting was not only safer, it was, in many situations, actually more effective than fighting heads-up. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, whose decision to fight buttoned up after his friend's death had saved his own life, described the advantages in a letter written in November 1944. At first I felt blind and helpless buttoned up, but after a few weeks, I realized I was actually getting better information from multiple sources than I ever got just looking around from the hatch. My gunner spots targets I would have missed. My driver warns me about terrain I couldn't see. Other tanks report what they observe. I'm building a picture of the battlefield from many viewpoints, instead of just my own, and I'm not dead, which helps. The British Army, facing similar commander casualty problems, conducted its own analysis in autumn 1944. The results closely paralleled American findings. British tank commanders fighting from open hatches suffered casualty rates 2.87 times higher than those who fought buttoned up, essentially identical to the American data. In October 1944, British 21st Army Group Headquarters issued tactical guidance strongly recommending buttoned-up fighting. Experience has shown that tank commanders suffer disproportionate casualties when fighting from open hatches. Commanders should remain buttoned up during combat operations, utilizing periscopes and crew coordination to maintain situational awareness. Brief observations with hatches open may be conducted when stationary in covered positions. The guidance was less directive than American Order's recommendation rather than requirement, but it represented official acknowledgement that previous doctrine had been flawed and that changes were necessary. Soviet tank forces, which had suffered appalling commander casualties throughout 1941 to 1943, also began emphasizing buttoned-up fighting by 1944. Soviet doctrine had always been less concerned with individual survivability than with mass and offensive momentum, But even Soviet commanders recognized that losing tank commanders to preventable casualties degraded unit effectiveness. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944 with improved turret design and better vision devices, made buttoned-up fighting more practical for Soviet crews. Combined with tactical guidance emphasizing closed hatches during combat, Soviet commander casualties decreased significantly in the final year of the war. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, buttoned-up fighting had become standard practice in most American and British armored units. The cultural resistance that had initially opposed the change had largely evaporated in the face of overwhelming evidence that it saved lives without compromising effectiveness. The final validation came from casualty statistics compiled after the war ended. The U.S. Army's official analysis of tank crew casualties in the European theatre, published in 1946, provided comprehensive data covering the entire campaign from North Africa through Germany. Total tank crewman casualties in the European theatre, 16,347. Of those, 4,129 were tank commanders, 25.3% of total casualties, despite commanders representing only 20% of crew positions. Commanders suffered casualty rates 1.26 times higher than other crew members overall, but the data became more revealing when broken down by time period and unit practices. In units that fought primarily with hatches open typical of 1943 and early 1944, commanders suffered casualty rates 3.04 times higher than other crew members. In units that adopted buttoned-up fighting, increasingly common from mid-1944 onward, commanders suffered casualty rates only 1.18 times higher than other crew members, nearly equal to the baseline. The report's conclusion was unambiguous. Fighting from open hatches increases tank commander casualty rates by approximately 300%, without corresponding tactical benefits. Units that adopted closed hatch procedures showed substantially reduced commander casualties, with no increase in tank losses or mission failures. Recommendation: tank commanders should fight buttoned up during combat operations as standard practice. The lesson had been learned, paid for in the blood of thousands of tank commanders who died because Doctrine had prioritized visibility over survival. By 1945, that doctrine had changed not because of theoretical analysis or staff studies, but because operational necessity and undeniable casualty statistics had forced armies to choose between tradition and reality. The shift from heads-up to buttoned-up fighting represented one of the most significant tactical evolutions of World War II armored warfare. It challenged deeply held beliefs about leadership and courage. It required soldiers to overcome instinctive resistance to being enclosed in steel boxes during combat. It demanded new skills and training to maintain effectiveness with reduced direct visibility. But it worked. Commanders who fought buttoned up survived at 3 times the rate of those who fought heads up. That statistic 3x survival rate became the quantifiable proof that sometimes the bravest act isn't standing exposed to face the enemy, but rather staying protected so you can lead your crew through the battle and bring them home alive. Captain Theodore Hartmann, the medical officer whose 1944 report had first documented the commander casualty problem statistically, survived the war and returned to his surgical practice in Boston. In 1952, he published a paper in the Journal of Military Medicine titled Positional Vulnerability Analysis: Lessons from World War II Tank Commander Casualties. The paper revisited his original data with the benefit of complete wartime records. His conclusion remained unchanged. Tank commanders fighting from open hatches suffered casualty rates 312% higher than commanders who fought buttoned up. This increased risk was entirely preventable and ultimately unnecessary. The tactical doctrine that required open hatch fighting cost thousands of lives before evidence-based analysis forced a change. The lesson extends beyond tank warfare. Military doctrine must adapt to operational reality, even when that reality contradicts long-standing assumptions and professional culture. Hartmann noted with satisfaction that by war's end, the lesson had been learned. Commander casualty rates had dropped dramatically in units that adopted buttoned-up fighting. Lives had been saved. The evidence had ultimately overcome tradition, but Hartmann also noted the human cost of learning that lesson. Thousands of tank commanders had died in 1943 and early 1944 because armies were slow to challenge established doctrine, even in the face of mounting casualties. How many of those men would have survived if the change had come earlier? How many families would have welcomed fathers home if the evidence had been acknowledged sooner? Those questions haunted Hartmann for the rest of his life. He'd documented the problem as early as 1944, but his recommendations had been largely ignored until battlefield casualties became too severe to dismiss. By the time doctrine changed, thousands of commanders had already died. The story of why tank commanders started fighting buttoned up is ultimately a story about how institutions learn slowly, painfully, and often only after paying terrible costs for their resistance to change. It's a story about the conflict between tradition and evidence, between professional culture and statistical reality, between the way things have always been done and the way they should be done. It's a story about the courage required not just to face the enemy, but to challenge assumptions that everyone believes are true. And it's a story with a simple, brutal moral. Sometimes, survival requires accepting that what feels right, standing tall, seeing clearly, leading visibly, is exactly what will get you killed. The tank commanders who learned to fight buttoned up didn't feel like heroes. They felt claustrophobic, isolated, and blind. But they survived. And survival in the end was the only statistic that truly mattered. 3 times more likely to survive. 3x. That number, calculated by a doctor in a tent in Italy and proven in the hedgerows of France, saved thousands of lives by war's end. It's a number worth remembering, a reminder that courage sometimes means staying protected, and that the deadliest enemy isn't always the one you can see, but the doctrine that insists you have to look. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.